Hey guys, tonight, we're sinking slowly into the steamy, squishy swamps of early Mesopotamia, where the sun rises heavy, the reeds whistle, and somewhere nearby, a vat of beer is groaning like it just remembered its taxes are due. The air smells like warm grain soup with a hint of damp goat. You're barefoot, your tunic is sticking to your back, and the sounds around you are not birds or bells, but rather the unsettling gurgle of fermentation punctuated by the occasional hiss, slosh, or burp from a clay vat that sounds a little too alive. You're here for the beer, or rather to witness the spectacularly chaotic, noisy, slightly holy, and entirely unavoidable mess that was ancient Mesopotamian brewing. Oh, and you probably won't survive this. Between the heatstroke, the questionable hygiene, and the fact that nobody's invented filters, yet your chances of getting through one cup without something weird floating in it are slim. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe it, only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments love, seeing how far this sleepy history spreads. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice is the smell. It's not exactly bad, just assertively fermented. Warm grain porridge that's been sitting in a wet clay pot under a beating sun for several days. Tangy, sour, frothy. It smells like lunch, but also like a dare. You trudge past wide irrigation ditches, squinting through the shimmer of heat that hangs above the barley fields. There's a clatter of sandals behind you, some worker hauling a crate of emmer grain toward a temple courtyard. It's early morning, but already the brewing process is well underway. In Mesopotamia, beer isn't just a beverage. It's currency, rations, religious offering, and comfort food, all wrapped into one sloshy, frothy mess. And it is loud. You approach the temple complex, cigarette looming above, goats tied lazily to columns, and hear it before you see it. Deep, wet bubbling from inside a row of open clay vats. Some pots are gently fizzing. Others emit soft, rhythmic popping like a frog hiccuping in a swamp. One near the corner lets out a sharp hiss, followed by a frothy belch that sprays a bit of barley mash onto the floor. No lids, of course. Mesopotamians weren't especially interested in sealing their fermenting pots. Whether that was a spiritual decision or a structural oversight, historians still argue. Whether the open-air brewing style was meant to invite divine yeast, or just the result of not having proper lids. You step closer and see a group of women squatting beside the vats, stirring with long paddles. The beer here isn't like the crisp golden stuff in your fridge. This is more like drinkable bread. A pulpy, soupy slurry made from fermented barley, sometimes spiced, sometimes sweetened with date syrup, but almost always cloudy enough to hide a small lizard. One of the brewers sings softly while she stirs. It's a hymn to Ninkasi, the goddess of beer. You might recognize it from cuneiform tablets unearthed in the ruins of Nepurtha, so-called hymn to Ninkasi, which doubles as both praise and brewing instructions. It's kind of like if your grandma's brownie recipe started with, "O beloved of the gods, stir with thine mighty spoon." Nearby, an apprentice topples a jug, splashing half a liter of fermenting mash across the floor. No one panics. Brewing here is messy, unpredictable, and much like the rest of Mesopotamian life, part divine chaos, part practical necessity. Everyone drinks beer, even children, especially children, actually, since water sources are questionable at best. Beer is safer, barely, and the noise is just part of the process. A cat tiptoes around the vats trying to lick some of the spilled mash, only to recoil with an offended sneeze. You can relate. Now, it's not that the Mesopotamians liked their beer loud. It's that they didn't know it could be quiet. Between the wild yeast fermenting at unpredictable speeds and the open pots gurgling with trapped carbon dioxide. Every stage of brewing came with its own set of squishy sound effects. Imagine trying to meditate while sitting next to a bubbling fondue of grain and swamp bubbles. That's the vibe. And yet, they made it work. The noise was part of the magic. For Mesopotamians, brewing wasn't just food prep, it was ritual. Sacred. You don't silence the gods' bubbly offerings. You listen and stir and let the barley sing. Or, depending on the day, burp. Blech. Historians still debate whether certain temples had specialized beer-making rooms, or if the process was always public. Some evidence points to multi-room complexes with drains and shallow brewing pools, while others suggest it was all done out in the open, because why hide the process if it pleases the gods? You crouch beside one of the clay pots. The surface is creamy with foam, and below it, you can hear faint popping like 1,000 tiny peas being boiled. You lean in a bit. It smells. Okay? No? It smells like raw dough left inside a used boot. Someone hands you a reed straw. You're supposed to drink straight from the vat straw style since straining was minimal and filters hadn't quite taken off. These straws sometimes had a bit of woven mesh near the base to catch floating grain bits. You give it a shot. It's thick, sourdough, fizzy, in a way that's almost nervous, like the beer's reconsidering its own existence while inside your mouth. A chunk of something soft grazes your tongue, and you decide not to investigate. Nearby, someone laughs. It's the priest, already halfway into his second scoop. He toasts to Ninkasi, and to the fact that his temple received an extra shipment of barley this month, probably from some war-torn city that forgot to keep its irrigation canals clean. You know, classic Mesopotamian drama. You sit quietly, lulled by the weirdly comforting rhythm of gurgling pots, sleepy chants, and the occasional frog croak from a reed patch nearby. The sun climbs higher, and the beer keeps bubbling. You start to wonder if you were a Mesopotamian deity watching from above. Would you be soothed by the sound of your followers' devotion brewing in wet, noisy harmony? Or would you file a divine noise complaint? Either way, the beer won't stop frothing. The pots won't stop hissing. And you, sticky, drowsy, and probably already mildly tipsy, are only just beginning to understand how noisy ancient Mesopotamian beer really was. You shuffle forward barefoot and drowsy, stepping around a loaf of half-dried mash someone left sunning on a reed mat. It's the color of wet cardboard and smells like betrayal. Behind you, the beer vats continue their symphony of soft fizzing and wet sighs. But now you're heading deeper into the temple complex, where the real brewing happens out of sight, but never out of earshot. You pass under a low archway, its mud brick walls painted with flaking ochre patterns that probably meant something once. Inside, the air thickens. Not from heat that's a constant, but from the sharp tang of malted barley fermenting in clay jars big enough to lose a toddler in. This is the brewing room, tucked beneath the ziggurat, shaded from the sun, filled with shadows, and the occasional fly that zigzags in search of regret. Here, the sounds are denser. The fermentation is farther along, and the gurgles are deeper, throatier. There's a vat in the corner that's practically singing to itself, burbling through layers of foam like a sleep-talking camel. One young brewer tosses in a clump of soaked bread, which dissolves on contact with a wet plop that makes everyone glance over, but say nothing. This temple doesn't just honor Ninkasi. It runs on her. Beer isn't a hobby, it's the economy. Temple workers are paid in it. Priests offer it to the gods. Travelers stop in to drink it, bless it, argue over it. The temple courtyard functions as both divine space and brewery floor, and you start to realize if the gods wanted silence, they'd have picked something else, like olive oil. Historians still argue whether temple beer was more refined than household brews, or just more blessed. Bless. Some cuneiform tablets describe multiple grades of beer like a Mesopotamian wine list, but others suggest it was all one big frothy mess with varying levels of chewiness. One clay tablet even lists a black beer so strong and dense it was likely consumed with something approaching fear. You inch toward a bench in the corner where someone's laid out chunks of partially dried mash next to a handful of herbs. There's juniper and maybe some crushed dates, and something that smells suspiciously like fermented garlic. Beer, you learn, was customizable. They didn't have hops, those would take a couple more millennia, but they did have flavor. And mood swings. One brewer insists a little honey keeps the bubbles down. Another says honey makes it louder. The debate escalates until someone spills a jug and a goat escapes. Noise isn't just tolerated in this room, it's essential. Every hiss, every froth pop is feedback. Brewing is live. If your mash isn't whispering to you by midday, it's probably dead. Or cursed. Or both. You crouch beside a particularly vigorous jar. It's got a sort of scummy foam crusting around the rim like someone's overenthusiastic latte. You poke it. It responds with a sound not unlike a human sigh. You blink. It sighs again. This one may be sentient. Behind you, an older woman chuckles. She's the senior brewer here, probably been fermenting since before your sandals had soles. She slaps your shoulder and says something that sounds like "Don't flirt with the mash, it always breaks hearts." You sit with her while she works. She mixes malted barley with twice-baked bread loaves, crushed with water, and then left to sit in large tubs open to the air. It's all very manual. Stir. Wait, sniff, stir again. There are no thermometers, no timers, just sound, smell, and experience. The wet, spongy plop of grain hitting the vat. The rising fizz as yeast wakes up and stretches. The slow exhale of bubbles slipping to the surface and popping like tiny, soggy firecrackers. There's a rhythm to it, like the temple is breathing. One of the scribes wanders in, clay tablet in hand, and tries to make sense of the brewing schedule. He's not a brewer, he's just the guy trying to document it all in cuneiform, without getting grain in his stylus. He's grumbling, says the schedule doesn't make sense. Beer is supposed to be ready by tomorrow, but one batch hasn't even started fermenting. The head brewer shrugs. The gods are fickle. Or maybe the yeast's just lazy today. You learn that brewing rooms like this were probably the heart of temple kitchens. Not just spiritually, but socially. Workers gathered here. Food was prepared. Rations were distributed. Noise meant activity. And activity meant survival. The louder the room, the healthier the operation. You glance at a corner where broken beer jugs are stacked. They're all handmade sun-dried clay, rough and unglazed. When they crack or explode as something, that apparently happens a lot during over-fermentation, they're just discarded and replaced. One fragment still has sticky foam clinging to its edges. Probably burst earlier today during what the brewers refer to with charming detachment as the midday pop dia. And yet, no one's annoyed. The burping jars, the whistling pots, the soft suck pop of fermentation, these are the sounds of life. They're comforting, like a grandmother's kitchen crossed with a bog monster. You lean back and try to imagine silence here. No froth, no hiss, just the dusty shuffle of sandals and the distant bleat of an irritated goat. It's, wrong. The beer's noise is the temple's heartbeat. Sure, it's gross and loud, and sometimes smells like someone tried to brew beer in a wet sandal. But without it, the place would feel abandoned. You begin to drowse, a little lulled by the sonic texture of brewing. The soft bubbling, the scrape of paddles in clay, the rhythmic splashes and murmured instruction sits like a strange lullaby, one that ends with hiccups. The woman next to you hums a bar of the Ninkasi hymn and hands you a cup. It's fresher than what you tried earlier, less soupy, more fizzy. A slight sweetness cuts through the sour. You sip, careful not to breathe in any of the suspended barley. It's better. Ah, still alarmingly chewy, but almost refreshing. The vat beside you lets out one final glorp, like a frog clearing its throat. It's done. Or at least it thinks it's done. You wipe your mouth, settle back against the wall, and decide you could get used to the noise. Or at the very least you're willing to tolerate it if it means getting paid in beer. You shuffle back into the open, blinking against the brutal Mesopotamian sun like a half-baked flatbread. The temple courtyard is even busier now. Vendors have set up rough reed mats stacked with squat jugs, loaves of beer bread, and strange sticky clusters of barley that look suspiciously like someone's forgotten science experiment. This is market day. Or more accurately, this is beer market, our own chaotic slice of time when people shout their lungs out in an effort to trade soup for grain, clay for soup, and beer for absolutely everything. And the beer, of course, is still loud. You pass by a row of open jars belching away under awnings, made from whatever fabric survived last flood season. One particularly ambitious vat lets out a high-pitched squeal like it's trying to whistle, but only got halfway there. You pause. No one else notices. The sounds of fermentation are just background noise here, like birdsong or a neighbor's broken pipe that no one ever fixes. A man yells something about 4 cups for a string of beads. A woman counters with 3 cups and a leftover fish. The hag next to her suggests 2 cups and no fish, which might actually be the better deal. You dodge a boy carrying a dripping jug on his shoulder. It smells aggressively sour and sloshes with wet confidence. That one's mid-ferment still bubbling away in transit. Somewhere inside that jug, the yeast is throwing a tiny rave. Beer wasn't sold in silence. It was sold with shouting laughter clinks and the wet glugs of unbalanced jugs. And honestly, you're starting to find the chaos charming. Sticky, loud, but charming. One thing becomes immediately clear: Mesopotamians weren't just drinking beer, they were constantly negotiating it. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a preferred mash ratio. Everyone's uncle swore by some secret trick involving dried figs and mild threats. The beer wasn't just nourishment, it was a statement. Historians still argue whether these markets were informal pop-ups or more structured trade fairs sponsored by temples or city officials. The records are vague. One clay tablet from the city of Uruk lists taxes on liquid bread during festival days, which suggests the beer was flowing fast and furiously. Another mentions a quiet corner for noble buyers, but considering how loud even the quiet beer is, you suspect that term was optimistic. You drift toward one of the clay counters, really just a slab over 2 crumbling barrel sand. Watch a vendor ladle beer into cups made of baked reed pulp. It's not elegant, but it gets the job done. The vendor's helper uses a flat reed to skim foam from the top of the jar, but it's a losing battle. The fermentation's active-aggressive even. Every scoop brings more foam, more bubbles, more pophis fizz from deep within the jug. It's as if the beer knows it's being watched. You finally gather enough nerve to purchase a small cup with a shiny shell button you found earlier. The vendor eyes it skeptically, but nods. She pours. It's a sound like soup and soap had an argument. You sip. It's different again. Earthier. Tangier. Somehow spicier, even though you're fairly certain there were no spices involved. You catch a glimpse of the jug it came from, decorated with a crude frog motif. Charming. Another nearby vendor is handing out beer bread to go with the drink. These are dense, chewy loaves half-baked for easier storage and fermentation. They're designed to be dropped into the mash, soaked and slurped. You try a bite dry and immediately regret it. Your jaw will need a nap after this. A little girl runs past you holding a tiny cup, which he proceeds to spill entirely over a slumbering goat. The goat opens one eye, blinks slowly, and then returns to sleep, perhaps vaguely buzzed. You make your way toward a shaded patch where a few elders are seated sipping through long reed straws from a communal bowl. They nod you over. Mesopotamian hospitality is loud but generous. The bowl's surface shivers with foam, and the smell is strong enough to slap. You lean in and slurp. This one's almost pleasant. It's been fermented longer. Fewer floating solids. The elders joke that this is beard beer because you can drink it without having to comb out grains afterward. One of them chuckles and slaps your back hard enough to make you inhale foam. You cough politely. They launch into a discussion about beer quality across districts. The west side, too watery. East side, froths like it's cursed. A priest supposedly declared one vendor's mash divinely unstable. That batch later exploded during transport. No one was injured except maybe a chicken. And this isn't just gossip. Mesopotamians took their beer very seriously. A poorly brewed batch could insult the gods, offend guests, or result in an impromptu tax audit. Clay tablets include long lists of beer measurements and qualities. Thick, thin, good foam. Too sour drinks like regret. Okay. Maybe not that last one, but it's implied. You spot a scribe at the edge of the crowd, scratching notes into a tablet while balancing a very full cup. He's muttering under his breath, probably trying to convert 1 goat of barley into cups per household ration, while sipping just enough to ensure it all makes less sense. Scribes were often in charge of recording beer distribution, especially for temple workers and government officials. It was part of the wage system. One worker might receive 5 cups per day, another 6 depending on rank skill, and whether they showed up on time with both sandals. There's a famous record from the city of Lagash where a scribe tracked beer rations for hundreds of workers. But the math doesn't math. Historians still argue whether the numbers were miscounted, deliberately fudged, or written after the scribe celebrated a little too hard at lunch. As you sit, warm beer in hand, a new commotion erupts at the edge of the market. A vendor's clay jug just cracked from internal pressure, and now bubbles out its remaining contents onto a mat of woven palm leaves. The smell is unfortunate. Everyone backs up. A woman yells something about insulting Ninkasi. A man offers to bless the spot with his backup jug. The whole thing resolves in laughter and more drinking. You sip again, only now realizing your cup has somehow refilled. The beer is warmer now, foamier, and almost reassuring in its never-ending insistence on being very, very loud. This, you understand, is the heartbeat of the city. Not the walls, not the scribes, not even the temples. It's this strange shared chaosity, sloshy, unpredictable. And as the market swells with more people, more jugs, more spontaneous belching from fermenting pots, you find yourself surprisingly calm. Sure, you're sticky, slightly drunk, and you may never look at barley the same way again. But the sun is high, the air hums with foam and shouting, and for now, there's nothing to do but sip and soak in the frothy noise of it all. You're lying on your back now, half shaded beneath a fig tree, cradling your latest cup of beer like it's a baby bird that smells like socks. The market still thrums with a gentle foamy roar behind you, like a bathhouse full of disgruntled frogs. But you're not thinking about commerce anymore. You're thinking about rules, regulations, the strange obsessive order that somehow coexisted with the bubbling chaos of early beer culture. Because for a society with literally explosive brewing techniques, the Mesopotamians had a lot of rules. Beer wasn't just something you made eat, it was something you managed. From temple to tavern brewer to scribe, every drop had to be accounted for. And if you think today's liquor laws are overcomplicated, imagine a world where a clay tablet decided your bar tab and misreporting your grain yield could get you a strongly worded goat sacrifice. You sit up slowly, brushing barley husks from your sleeve. A pair of women walk past you, both carrying matching clay vessels shaped like, well, let's say the Mesopotamians were big fans of symbolic curves. These women are not just beer drinkers, they're tavern keepers. And taverns in this world are serious business. Historians still argue whether these establishments were state or temple affiliated, or just freelance ventures with a side of tax evasion. Some suggest taverns were primarily run by women, often widows or priestesses, who had enough social standing and brewing skill to run a tight ship. Others say anyone could start a tavern as long as they knew how to ferment and how to shout louder than a bubbling jug. You follow the women to a narrow alley painted with chalky glyphs and wander into the dim interior of what is unmistakably a drinking house. It's not larger, 3 benches, 1 long table, and a back wall stacked with jars. The air here is thicker, warmer, less temple, more body heat and bad decisions. The sounds are similar to what you may heard elsewhere: gurgling vats, wet plips, the occasional glassy clunk of reed straws meeting ceramic. But there's something else, something sharper, a kind of structure. The chaos is managed, not silenced, just steered. You sit at the far end and watch the tavern keeper in action. She moves between jugs, with precision tapping each one with a stick before serving from it. The stick tells her what her ears already know. If a jar sounds like it's holding a swamp demon, it's probably not ready. If it sighs softly like a tired frog, perfect. She ladles out servings by hand, counting aloud. She keeps track of who owes what with tiny clay tokens, each the shape of a barley grain. And yes, that's where accounting comes in. You see, Mesopotamians didn't just write about beer, they invented accounting for it. The earliest records we have aren't romantic poems or war stories. They're lists, rations, barley in, beer out. One scribe famously tracked how many jars went to which worker when, and how often. That's right, civilization was built on the desire to not be shorted a pint. You overhear 2 regulars arguing about one such scribe. Apparently his name was something like Dudu, which might have been funny then too. One claims Dudu underreported grain to the temple to skim beer for himself. The other insists he just had bad math. Neither seems particularly sober. There's another law tablet hanging on the wall. The infamous Code of Hammurabi gets name-dropped in your brain like a pop song. This one has rules for tavern keepers, and they're not subtle. If a tavern keeper waters down beer, punishable. If they fail to report a political conspiracy overheard in their bar, executable. If they overcharge a nobleman, let's just say they'd better have extra jugs and a fast goat. But here's the quirky bit. Some of these taverns were allowed to operate as banks. You could store grain there. Even leave clay tokens sincerely. I use in exchange for future beer. So imagine going to your local pub, buying a pint, and casually saying, "Put the rest on my barley account." And the barman nods because he has an abacus shaped like a cow's nose. You lean forward and sip what the tavern keeper sets down in front of you. This one is smoother. Still warm, but not as aggressively foamy. It has a whispery, fizz-like, a carbonated sigh. You're told it's been filtered twice, which probably just means someone poured it through a slightly cleaner reed basket. The woman explains that sound is her best tool. She listens to her jars all day. She can tell when they're too hot, too old, too full, or just angry. A gurgle in the morning, Bad. A low thrum after sundown. Perfect. She claims the yeast communicates, and you're not entirely sure she's wrong. And you start to wonder, was the noise always this important? Historians still argue whether ancient Mesopotamians intentionally cultivated their brewing microbes for specific sounds, or if they just adapted to the chaos. Some suggest that early brewers had ear skills not unlike sommeliers today, sniffing corks and swirling glasses. Others think it was superstition layered over real chemistry. You glance around. One regular has his head resting gently against a fermentation pot like Hez, listening to a lullaby. Another one claps softly after each sip, a private ritual you decide not to question. You shift in your seat and notice a small clay seal stamped with a barley emblem and the word for verify. Government quality control. Or just a brand. Either way, it tells you this tavern plays by the rules. Probably. You try to imagine this same setup with modern health inspectors. It doesn't go well. As night crawls over the sky, the tavern gets louder. Not the people, the beer. The jars are warming, slightly waking the yeast, bubbling in sleepy protest. It's like they're annoyed at being drunk too soon. You lean in and hear one let out a deep, reluctant groan. Not unlike how you feel when you remember what time you have to get up tomorrow. Someone sings a line from the Ninkasi hymn again. A sleepy, half-slurred tribute to the goddess who blesses the barley and the foam. You hum along, even though you don't know the words. The jars sing back in pops and sighs and sloppy little belches. It's a beer bar symphony. Every note off-key. Every noise earned. You close your eyes for a moment. Your head tilts back against the cool clay wall. You've stopped sweating. Either the beer is working, or your body has given up trying to regulate temperature. Either way, it's fine. In this warm, echoing tavern, you start to understand that the noise of Mesopotamian beer wasn't just a side effect. It was a language. It told them when to pour, when to stir, when to duck and cover. And more than that, it was comfort. A promise that the world, however messy, was still bubbling along. Just as you begin to drift off, the tavern keeper tosses a cloth over the nearest jar. Even yeast, it seems, needs sleep. You wake up to a snort. Not yours, probably. It came from somewhere behind a cluster of ceramic jars that seem to have multiplied overnight. The tavern is quieter now, dimly lit by a narrow shaft of sunrise that slices through the reed curtain like a lazy blade. But even in this semi-silence, the beer isn't done talking. You stretch your back, grimace at a mild crick in your neck, and listen. Bloop. Dot. You hear it again, a gentle glug from the corner. A vessel somewhere has kicked back into life. It's not the explosive belching of early fermentation, more like a weary sigh beer that's aged just enough to regret its youth. You stand and wander over, carefully navigating between dozing patrons and half-empty jars. No one stirs. The beer sings on. Today, it's time to learn how Mesopotamians controlled all this chaos, or tried to. Because for something as stubbornly noisy and alive as beer, there had to be tricks, tools, systems, or at the very least, desperate hacks handed down over generations like sacred family recipes. And yes, it turns out that even 4,000 years ago, brewers had to deal with wild yeast, bubbling overflows, and the terrifying realization that beer sometimes exploded if you looked at it wrong. The Mesopotamians weren't clueless. They had techniques. One of the earliest known was temperature management. Without modern thermometers, brewers relied on touch. They'd press a hand to the side of the jar, or in some cases, lean a cheek against it to feel the heat. If the jar was too warm, fermentation might speed up uncontrollably. If too cold, the yeast would sulk and stop. So they buried jars in pits, covered them with wet cloth, or shaded them in special rooms with airflow built right into the walls. One curious technique involved wrapping the base of a fermentation pot in damp reeds and placing it on a slab of river stone. The evaporation would cool the jar just enough to keep things from going haywire. Ingenious, right? Primitive beer science powered by sweat and prayer. You crouch next to one of the shaded jars and listen. Bloop. Dot. Still going. Now about the vessels themselves. These weren't your typical beer bottles. Mesopotamian brewers used amphorae jars and pitholarge clay containers, often sealed with mud or woven caps. But here's where it gets fun. Some of them had small holes or whistles built into the rim, not for drinking. Oh, for pressure release. Think of it as the ancient version of a burp valve. Historians still argue whether these little holes were intentional brewing innovations or just accidents that turned out to be helpful. Some archaeologists found what they call singing jars near nipper jugs that made high whiny whistles during fermentation. Locals probably hated them, or adored them, or tuned them into household harmony like the world's worst wind chimes. You peek into one such jar. The foam has settled into a pale beige cap, cracked like dried riverbed. A slow fizz builds under the surface, occasional bubbles rising and popping like cereal in hot milk. The smell is sour, but familiar. A good batch. Another way Mesopotamians managed fermentation. The timing of ingredients. You couldn't just toss everything in and hope. You needed to start with soaked barley called bapir, a kind of halfway breadened, then add water and old mash in just the right order. Adding yeast too soon would cook it, too late, and nothing would happen. So they staggered steps, sometimes waiting hours between each. It was part art, part instinct, part standing around and hoping the gods were in a good mood. And the gods, especially Ninkasi, goddess of beer, were definitely part of the equation. Rituals helped keep the process steady. A brewer might hum a line of her hymn before sealing a jar, might whisper her name before checking a batch. You try this now, muttering something that sounds vaguely divine. The beer doesn't explode. Success. In some temples, beer production was organized like clockwork. Workers had roles: the mashers, the stirrers, the foam scoopers, the clay sealers. Each job mattered. Each had to be timed with the beer's burping rhythm. In one particularly well-preserved tablet, there's a reference to the night keeper, someone whose job it was to listen to the beer while everyone else slept. If it made the wrong sound, too loud, too soft, too angry to wake the brewer. Imagine that as your job title, assistant to the jar listener. Now here's the fringe bit, the thing historians side-eye, but secretly love. Some believe Mesopotamians used acoustic divination, literally reading the future in the sound of fermenting beer. One tablet mentions a priestess who could interpret the bubbles to decide whether a marriage would succeed. Another refers to a soldier refusing a batch because it sounded unlucky. Was it superstition? Maybe. But when your beer could wake the dead, you'd be cautious too. You press your ear to another jar. It's warmer. Busier. A soft thrumming beneath the lid. This one's alive. You stand and take in the whole tavern. By now, most of the patrons are gone. A few linger, sweeping up crumbs or resetting cups. The tavern keeper is already prepping a new batch. She lifts a basket of soaked barley and lets it drain into a wide jar. The plop is deliberate. She listens for the note it hits, deep mellow. She nods, satisfied. The whole process is tuned by ear. It's music. A messy, bubbly lullaby. And just when you think you've seen it all, she brings out a fermentation lid with what looks like a carved face. 2 holes for eyes. one for the mouths strategically placed for foam to escape. It sings as she lowers it onto the vessel. A faint whistle. She grins. You hear that? She says. You nod. It sounds like a breeze with indigestion. Means it's working. She offers you a small scoop of the new mash. It's warm. Pasty. A bit like licking oatmeal that's been left in a sauna. Oh, but there's something comforting about it. You chew slowly, listening to the background noise of brewing gurgles. Hisses, soft clinks of cups being cleaned. Even now the beer speaks. And the Mesopotamians listened. So the next time your soda hisses or your soup gurgles ominously, in the microwave, remember you're hearing echoes of a system so old, so beautifully ridiculous, that it built cities, temples, laws, and possibly the first hangover ever documented in cuneiform. You step outside blinking against the rising sun. The alley hums faintly behind you. Not from voices, from jars, from ancient science, from controlled chaos. And somewhere a little clay whistle gives a final sleepy toot. The street is quieter now, more yawn than roar. You stroll along the edge of the canal, and for once there's no shouting, no ox cart grinding its way through yesterday's barley. Just the lap of brown water against stone, and the slow chirping of birds that look like someone halfway through inventing pigeons. But your ears are still tuned to fermentation. Every little splash and crackle reminds you of jars of songs in the foam of that soft bloop that somehow became your lullaby. And now, as the city stirs to life, you turn your thoughts toward distribution, because once beer was made and managed, it had to move. And let's just say moving large amounts of beer in ancient Mesopotamia wasn't exactly an Amazon Prime situation. Imagine rows of ceramic jars, each nearly as tall as your hip, filled with sloshing, half-fermented liquid and sealed only with wax or a scrap of cloth. Now, picture trying to haul that across a city where the streets are either dust or mud depending on whether the gods remembered to turn off the sky faucet. That's where you come in. You're now a beer transporter. Your cart is creaky, your donkeys are moody, and you're delivering to a temple kitchen before the sun gets too high. The clay jars are strapped down with rope and wrapped in straw to absorb the slosh. Not for stability, just to keep the yelling to a minimum when the foam inevitably escapes. You roll forward. Every bump, every rattle is met with a gentle plop, a warning from your cargo. And here's where it gets weird. You listen. You have to. If the beer starts to churn or scream, it might mean fermentation's reactivating. That's bad. You pull over, let it calm down, maybe pour off a little foam and whisper something apologetic to Ninkasi. Historians still argue whether professional beer haulers existed as a trade, or delivery was just something apprentices did when they annoyed their masters. One school of thought claims some families specialized in the beer route, with ancestral maps showing the smoothest roads and the gentlest ramps. Others believe temple slaves did most of the heavy lifting, sometimes forming human chains to pass jars hand to hand, like bubbly sandbags. As you arrive at the temple gates, you're waved through without inspection. That's the perk of delivering the good stuff. Temples, you learn quickly, were some of the biggest consumers of beer in all of Mesopotamia. They didn't just drink it, they used it as salary sacrifice medicine, even social glue. A newly hired worker. Here's your monthly ration, 7 jars and a pat on the back. A priest falling ill. Brew up something thick with herbs and honey. A god feeling neglected. Pour out a perfect pint and place it on the altar. No backwash allowed. And here's your historical nugget of the day: beer rations were standardized. Seriously. There were official records-long, tedious clay lists that outlined how much beer a worker got per day based on rank, role, and age. A temple singer might get less than a bricklayer, but more than a goat herder. and you could upgrade your portion with favors or good behavior. In one particularly juicy tablet, a scribe complains that the beer for the cart puller was weak and flatties. Even then, people had opinions about flat beer. But the temples didn't always just receive. They also brewed their own. You're led around to the temple's back courtyard, where a team of workshop priests half brew a sair elbow deep in bubbling vats. The noise here is less rowdy, more reverent. Bubbles are sacred. Foam is a sign the gods approve. Someone chants softly as they stir. Another person sprinkles herbs into the mash like seasoning a divine stew. What? And in a shaded corner, you find the beer scribe. Now this person's job is deeply serious. They track every drop that goes in, every serving that goes out, and every complaint logged usually in neat little cuneiform slashes on wet tablets. But this scribe isn't just crunching numbers. They're also listening. Too loud, they mutter, leaning close to one jar. Means the yeast is overeating. You raise an eyebrow, and they explain different yeast strains had different voices. Some sang like frogs. Others hissed like wet sandals. Experienced scribes could identify a rogue strain just by its tone. It sounds fake. But then you hear a shrill hiss from the corner jar. The scribe winces. That one, they say flatly, has opinions. As quirky as it sounds, beer distribution was wrapped in ritual and logistics. Moving beer between temple kitchens, taverns, and elite households required coordination. Some jars were marked with destination, symbols, a sort of prehistoric delivery label. Others had carved seals on the lid to prevent tampering. Break the seal, lose your job. Or worse, get reassigned to dung collection. You help unload your cargo. A few jars gurgle in protest, one belches in relief. The head brewer thanks you with a splash of warm beer in a wooden cup. You drink it without hesitation. It's part reward, part right. And then you spot something odd. At the edge of the courtyard is a storage room, and in the gloom you make out racks, actual wooden racks, designed to cradle the jars sideways. Not upright. Sideways. You ask why. The scribe shrugs, makes them quieter. Apparently this angle slows the foam. The gases escape in little sighs instead of percussive belches. The yeast rests easier. You peer into one of the side jars and hear it pop. Peaceful. Almost meditative. Fringe historians claim this storage method came from early beer monasteries, a term that makes actual scholars twitch. But the idea sticks. Quiet beer is calm beer. And calm beer is safer to move, to serve, to sacrifice. As you make your way back through the temple gates, your cart empty, your ears filled with a fresh collection of fermenty murmurs, you realize something. Noise wasn't just part of beer, it was how they measured success. A silent jar was suspicious. Too quiet. Maybe the gods disapproved. Too noisy. Maybe the batch was possessed. But just the right rhythm, the perfect bubbly harmony that meant the brew was alive but manageable. Tamed chaos in a jar. You reach the edge of the canal again. The breeze smells faintly of grain and sun-warmed yeast. In the distance, you hear a jar whistle like a bird with a stuffy nose. And somehow it makes you smile. By now you've inhaled more beer fumes than air and heard more bloops than conversations, but Mesopotamia still isn't done showing off. Because for all the brewing, bubbling, and carefully whistled jars, you haven't yet tackled what might be the strangest, most gloriously unnecessary part of the whole noisy beer economy presentation. Yes, once the beer was brewed, transported, and divinely approved, it had to be served and not just poured. It had to be shown off. Because if you were drinking beer in ancient Mesopotamia, you weren't just satisfying thirst. You were making a statement. You're back at the tavern now. Doorways shaded with woven reeds, and inside the clay floor has been swept clean. The jars, as usual, are murmuring. But something's changed. There's an energy in the air, a vibe that says somebody important is coming, and we need to impress the foam out of them. You take a seat by the wall and watch as the tavern keeper begins prepping her most dramatic serving jars. These aren't storage containers or simple mugs. These are ceremonial drinking vessels, and each one is as extra as a clay object can possibly be. One looks like a lion's head. Another is shaped like a reclining nude woman with beer pouring from her belly. A third. It just has holes everywhere, more sieve than cup. You're fairly sure it leaks for a living. And that, apparently, is the point. See, in Mesopotamian taverns and feasting halls, beer wasn't just consumed. It was performed. Here is your historical anchor for the evening. The elite often drank beer through long, elaborately carved straws, sometimes made of gold or lapis lazuli. Because why not suck warm barley sludge through precious gems if you're trying to flex in front of the priesthood? These straws were necessary to whirly beer. Was thick, porridgey, and full of floating sediment. So instead of filtering it like reasonable humans, the Mesopotamians just drank around it. But it didn't stop there. One record from Uruk describes a banquet with a straw tree, a central vessel so large it held over 40 liters of beer with multiple straws sticking out like a weird alcoholic octopus. Each guest got a straw. If your straw touched another person's, you were either instantly married or forced to trade seats. Historians still argue the rules. And here's the quirky tidbit. Some scholars believe that certain noises during serving were considered auspicious. A good glug meant your host liked you. A long, high-pitched pour. That was the beer's way of flirting. One text describes a feast where the host kept filling the goblets until they hissed with pleasure. Hissed. Oh. With pleasure. Ancient Mesopotamian, ACR. You lean back as a new guest enters. As important, clearly. Robes so fine they shimmer like fish scales, rings on every finger. The tavern keeper greets him with a small bow, then gestures toward a stool, polished to near reflection. And then it begins the serving ritual. First, she chooses a jarron from the back where the oldest brew rests. It groans slightly as it's lifted. Not metaphorically. The jar literally groans. Probably gas buildup. Hopefully not a curse. She uncorks it slowly. The foam rises in a lazy spiral. And for a moment, the entire tavern watches. If it overflows, it's bad luck. If it dies too fast, the gods are unimpressed. But this one, it gives a gentle pah, like a soft snore, then settles. Perfect. She ladles the beer into a two-handled goblet with carved cuneiform on the rim. You sneak a peek. It says something like to drink is to live, to spill is to weep. Charming. She pours with grace from high above in a slow stream. The sound is crisp, deliberate, like a string being plucked. The guest watches clearly, judging every drop. When the foam reaches the top of the cup, she sets it down and takes a step back. The man raises the goblet, lifts it to his nose, and inhales. Deeply, like Hez about to write a poem about it. Then he takes a sip, no slurping, but enough noise to make a point. He smiles. Cheers erupt. Someone plays a flute. A child inexplicably releases a pigeon indoors. And just like that, the beer has passed its final test. It was seen. You're offered a drink too, though yours comes in a less glamorous cup, simple clay, no carvings. But the taste, still rich, a little sour, a little sweet, faint hints of date and herbs. It hums gently in your throat, the way a lullaby might feel if you drank it. Around you, the tavern becomes a stage. Another guest requests a quiet pour while someone else demands extra fizz. The tavern keeper obliges, adjusting her technique, choosing different jars, even tapping on the sides to wake up the sleepy ones. It's less bartending, more beer whispering. One particular confident customer insists that he can hear when a jar is lying. You watch as he sniffs at a jug and snorts. Too cheerful. It's hiding bitterness. Fringe belief. Maybe. But in a world where beer talks, who are you to argue? A scholar nearby scribbles on a wax tablet. You ask what he's writing, and he says it's a manual of the audible qualities of pouring. Apparently he's cataloging the different sounds of serving beer and what they might mean for its flavor. His tablet includes notations like plup plup earthy, with strong foam, gull orc sour, possibly overaged S ideal, balance pleasant aroma, thwip danger, stop immediately. You nod, as if this makes perfect sense. So here you are in a tavern that doubles as a symphony hall, sipping something ancient and fizzy while decoding the musical score of beer service. It's absurd. It's beautiful. It's exactly what the Mesopotamians would have wanted. And as night begins to stretch across the sky, turning the reed walls into gold, you realize something soft and odd presentation wasn't just for show. It was for safety, for status, for soothing the gods, and maybe just maybe for making people feel seen. A whistle from the corner tells you another jar is ready. You close your eyes. You listen. And somewhere, a beer sighs in approval. The light in the tavern shifts, dimmed, now thick with the smell of roasted onions, sweat, and fermented barley. Somewhere in the back, a drunk scribe is snoring softly into his empty bowl, and you're a little buzzed from all of the beer watching. Not drinking, just watching, which in Mesopotamia was an Olympic event in itself. But if you think beer was only a social affair, you haven't met the bureaucrats yet. You step outside into the dusky streets of Ur, or maybe Nipper. Honestly, it's hard to tell with all the mud brick and stray goats. What you do recognize is the squat little building with the carefully carved sign above its door, a stylized jar, a reed stylus, and off, all things a pair of eyes. Welcome to the beer administration office. No joke. This is where the magic of Mesopotamian beer accounting happens. Inside, the air is thick with clay dust and quiet desperation. Rows of scribes sit at low tables, styluses twitching like insect legs. They work in silence, broken only by the occasional sigh or the sound of someone aggressively scratching out a miswritten logogram. You sit down beside one who doesn't even look up as he mutters delivery or complaint. You go with delivery. Safer. Andi. He sighs again, slides over a small damp clay tablet, and gestures at a jar of styluses. You try to make sense of the rows. There's a column for date based on the moon, another for location coded by the shape of your street, and a third for beer type, though. The scribble there looks suspiciously like the sign for frothy panic. And here's your mainstream fact of the night: Mesopotamian record-keeping was deeply obsessed with beer. The earliest surviving written documents in human history. Not epic poems, not royal decrees. They're beer receipts. Little tablets that basically say, gave worker X much beer on Y day for Z reason. Don't yell at me. Scholars love this. It means we have extensive data about beer rations, ingredient allotments, fermentation schedules, and even taste notes. One record literally reads batch, bitter blamed on old malt. Avoid, jar, 9b. If Yelp existed back then, it was baked in clay and carried the weight of bureaucracy. But not all beer entries are boring. One features a tiny sketch of a man lying on his side with 3 jars and a very wobbly line above him. The caption, roughly exceeded ration, did not return till moonrise. A warning or a flex, you decide. What's fascinating and a little terrifying just how centralized the system was. Temples didn't just make and distribute beer, they regulated it down to the last sticky drop. Every jar was tagged. Every serving logged. There were tablets tracking who drank what, when, how much, and why. You ask the scribe if all this noise of frothing, hissing, squealing jar server made it into official records. He thinks for a moment, then nods. Sometimes, if it made them open a new jar early or delay a feast. Foam can ruin a schedule. That's the quirk of the section. Some temples assigned sound grades to their batches, denoting how cooperative or chatty the beer was. Jars were ranked on a scale from silent to riot. No one liked the riot jars. He shows you one such tablet jar for Ragergold excessively delayed offering. You stare at it for a long time. It's both absurd and entirely logical. And here's where it gets more fun, those records. They weren't just for local use. Some were sent to other cities, like brewing memos carried by clay-enveloped couriers who guarded them like divine messages. Historians still argue whether these detailed beer logs were meant for taxation or competition. One camp says it was about control, how much everyone has tax accordingly, and prevent smuggling. Another thinks cities flaunted their beer stats like sports teams. Lagash brewed 90 liters last month. Beat that Uruk. You love that idea. Imagine sweaty scribes competing over who had the noisiest foam or the most respectful hiss. Ancient Mesopotamian Beer League. But bureaucracy wasn't just about numbers. It also had a face. Literally, you're led to a back room where they store the most important records portrait tablets. No, not selfies. These are cuneiform tablets shaped like jars with little clay faces on them, representing specific brews. One frowns. One grins. One looks like it's mid-burp. You point. The scribe grins. That one's legendary, called Little Anger. Foam during eclipses. There's pride here, not just in brewing, but in documenting the chaos, in putting noisy, unpredictable beer into neat clay boxes. And outside the office, there's an archive pit. Yes, a literal hole in the ground, full of discarded, broken, or outdated beer tablets. You climb up to its edge and peer in. Hundreds, maybe thousands of records beer logs, scribe jokes, accounting, errors baked into immortality, and then dumped when someone spilled coffee or conquered a city. Down there, lost among the fragments, is the whole rhythm of a civilization, the clinks and clatters, the bloops and burps, the whispered she of a jar mid-ferment. You return to the street, slightly clay-smudged, and listen again. The city is alive, yes, but so is the paperwork. Every sip of beer someone takes, it's probably logged somewhere. And if it was too noisy, that's on record too. You pass another temple. Someone inside is chanting. A jar howls faintly in the courtyard. Another scribe sighs and picks up his stylus. Juve never felt closer to administrative greatness. By now, Juve slurped through the foam, survived the scribes, and grown alarmingly comfortable around semi-sentient drinkware. But you still haven't answered a key question: who actually got to drink all this bubbling barley potion? You'd think everyone, right? Beer for the people. A river of suds flowing from priest to peasant. But as you trail behind a cluster of laborers, moving slowly down a dusty path bare feet, sun-leathered shoulders, you notice something. They aren't just heading home. They're heading toward their payment. Because in ancient Mesopotamia, beer wasn't just a treat. It was your salary. Let's ground this in a good old historical fact for many workers. especially in temple or state service wages, were paid not in coins or grain but in beer. Daily rations, carefully portioned, calculated by rank roll, and how annoyed the foreman was that morning. Beer wasn't just sustenance, it was economic glue. You pass a rationing station. No gold, no scales. Just big clay vessels and a bored-looking official with a ladle. A sign in etched cuneiform reads 2/3 job per brickmaker. One full for oxtender. None for the man who lost the goat. Fair. You watch a brickmaker step up. His hands are covered in dried mud. He's sunburned, dehydrated, and smiling like it's his birthday. The official dips the ladle into a large vessel, listens to the ploop, then fills a clay cup and hands it over. The man sips, exhales deeply, and nods. You can almost hear his joints relaxing. You ask the official if all jobs earn the same beer. He scoffs. Of course not. Priests get better, thicker, non-neodress. Minotaur, ni wasentients. Frothier. Status foam. Naturally. Here is your quirky tidbit. Tablets from Agash suggest that different types of beer were reserved for different social classes, and not just by taste or alcohol content, but by sound. One popular theory claims that high-ranking individuals were given beer that made softer, more dignified noises when poured. Loud, chattery beer. That was for the field hands. A weird detail, but not hard to believe in a culture that literally named beers after their acoustic moods. You pass a small brewery annex with jar labels that read "Gentle mother foams softly," ideal for scribes. Laughing reed gurgles, mid-pour common among carpenters. Cursing clay spits loudly, reserved for tax collectors. One worker nearby jokes, "If it doesn't hiss at me, it's not strong enough." His friend shrugs. "I prefer the kind that whimpers." It's absurd, sure, but also deeply human. Even today, we categorize things by class. Mesopotamians just happened to do it with beer that talked back. Historians still argue whether these sound-based assignments were ritual, practical, or pure superstition. Some believe quieter beer was easier to store and transport, so naturally it was offered to elites. Others argue that loud beer was seen as youthful, exuberant, good for energizing laborers. A few outliers even claim that certain noises were interpreted as disrespectful and thus unfit for the nobility. Yes, beer could be rude. Back on the street, a group of children run by laughing, chasing a goat wearing a wreath of reeds. It's unclear whether the goat is part of a festival or just really fashionable. One kid pauses to scoop up a fallen cup, tips it, and listens. Empty. Empty. He frowns dramatically. An older woman watches from a nearby step and says even children know. Quiet cup, quiet stomach. You find that saying oddly poetic, maybe even true. As you wander further, you come across something unexpected, a ration complaint tent. Yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. A tiny setup with 2 stools, 1 clay tablet, and a man who looks like he's made a full career out of sighing. His listening to a potter argue that her beer rations have grown weaker, less sound, more sadness. The man listens patiently. Then he opens a small jar, pours it gently into a wooden bowl, and tilts his head. The sound is thin. More blip than bloop. Dotty. He nods solemnly. You were right to come. You can't help but laugh, but the woman takes it seriously. She nods back, crosses her arms, and demands an extra half ration for the disrespect. A scribe nearby starts documenting the whole encounter. Another clay tablet bites the dust. This was real, you realize. Rations weren't faceless bureaucracy, they were intimate. You could hear when you were getting shortchanged. You could feel it in your cup. One fascinating case scribbled on a tablet from Umma tells of a worker who recorded 5 consecutive days of quiet beer then took it up the chain. Eventually, the temple brewing team was summoned to answer for dishonest silence. Verdict: D. 9. A batch was too young, too cold, and had been jarred under a cloudy moon, sacrificing noise and taste alike. They were fined 3 jars. The worker got an apology and a fresh pour. You can't make this stuff up. As the sun droops low, the ration tent closes shop, and workers begin their slow shuffle, home some sipping, some saving. You follow them down narrow alleys, hearing their cups slosh and clink. Every splash is a paycheck, every burble a small luxury. At one doorway, a man lifts his cup to the sky and murmurs a short prayer. May Ninkasi keep the foam strong. You murmur it too, just to be polite. Someone else calls out, did yours laugh today? A chorus of responses follows, chuckled, moaned, silent as a goat in heat. You smile. It's the kind of workplace banter that stretches across millennia. Because even when your job is hauling bricks in a desert, even when your feet are cracked and your back sore, and you haven't seen a priest smile in a month, there is beer, bubbling, alive, defiant. And sometimes it even giggles at your jokes. You step inside a humble, hall-mud brick, low ceiling, cool shadows. A woman hands her husband a clay bowl. He takes a sip, nods, and says softly, "It sang today." And just like that, a hard day becomes a little less unbearable. The streets quiet down, shadows stretch long across the mud brick walls, and the ever-present background hum of city life fades into a soft hush, punctuated only by the occasional hiccup from a well-sauced neighbor. You wander toward the city's outer ring, where the air smells less like roasted barley and more like dust, livestock, and the faint tang of ritual incense. Here, beer leaves the worksite and the tavern behind. Now it becomes sacred. You arrive at the zigguratone of those iconic Mesopotamian stepped temples, towering like a tiered wedding cake, designed by someone deeply into triangles. You climb the sloped ramp, feeling each level open up into new layers of silence. On the topmost terrace, a group of priests in flaxen robes is gathered around a circle of jars. Some bubble softly. Others stand still, like they know better than to embarrass themselves in front of the gods. A priest catches your eye, smiles slightly, and motions for you to sit. You do, cross-legged, as another priest waves a small fan over the jars. Not for cooling, for coaxing the right tone. Tonight, the beer isn't for drinking. It's for offering. Mainstream fact: incoming beer played a major role in Mesopotamian religious ritual. It was poured out for deities used to anoint idols and offered during festivals, honoring gods like Enki and Anna, and especially Ninkasi, goddess of beer and fermentation. Some temples even had dedicated brewing shrines where the process itself was a devotional act. You watch as a priest dips a golden ladle into a jar and gently pours its contents into a wide bowl. The sound: a soft syrupy glug followed by a delicate fizz that evaporates into the evening air like a whispered secret. He nods approvingly. The god will like that one. Another priest, less satisfied, frowns at a jar that lets out a rude splurt and a wet-sounding sigh. He mutters, "Well, save that one for the minor gods." You don't know whether to laugh or look solemn. You do both awkwardly. Here is your quirky tidbit. Some rituals involved beer being listened to before it was offered as a form of divination. The temple would interpret the foam's formation, the sound of the pour, even the timing of a pop or hiss. It wasn't just about quality, it was about signs. A double gurgle could mean a favorable harvest. A silent jar. A warning. A squeal. Marriage trouble ahead. Basically, it was a babbling oracle in a pot. You lean in as a young apprentice listens intently to a freshly opened jar. His face is serious, as though decoding a prophecy. Finally, he murmurs 2 sharp clicks. One long release. The barley is pleased. The others nod as if this is both obvious and deeply profound. Historians still argue whether these sound-based rituals were true spiritual practices or clever theater. Some suggest the priests genuinely believed the beer was a conduit to divine willers, argue it was more about pageantry symbolism and crowd control. After all, a bubbling jar is much easier to sell as mystical than a quiet loaf of bread. You sit and watch as the ceremony unfolds. A priest chants verse, probably something between a prayer and a recipe, and as he finishes, the head brewer steps forward and bows. It's clear this isn't just religion. This is collaboration. A shared performance between science, faith, and yeast. Later, you're allowed to approach a small side shrine where a single jar sits in isolation. Its lid is partially open, and the air around it hums faintly. This, you're told, is the god jar, the most sacred vessel of the batch. It's brewed using barley harvested under a full moon, stored with sandalwood shavings, and never stirred with metal. Only reed. You ask softly what sound this one makes. A priest leans in, listens, then whispers it breathes. You get goosebumps, either from reverence or the fact that the jar does seem to exhale every now and then. You wonder how many gods have been offered these living libations, how many prayers have floated to the heavens on the back of barley bubbles. A breeze picks up, carrying the scent of the beer offerings, multi, sweet, slightly herbal. It mingles with the incense and stars beginning to show above. The city's chaos feels far away, muffled like a dream. You glance back at the priests now cleaning the ladles and jars. One drops a vessel that lets out a high-pitched whine as it wobbles unbroken on the stone floor. He winces. That's going to be a long night. You follow him as he takes it to a quiet alcove labeled unsuitable offerings. Inside are several jars, all disqualified for one reason or another: too sour, too quiet, too loud, too eager. One you notice is sealed with a small clay plug shaped like a tongue. You raise an eyebrow. The priest shrugs. It wouldn't shut up. Even in a holy place, some beer is too unruly for the divine. And yet it's all treated with care. Because here beer isn't just a beverage. It's a bridge between human and god, laborer and priest, mud and mystery. You descend the ziggurat slowly, each step lower and darker than the last. At the base, a child is sweeping the courtyard. He pauses as you pass, tips a tiny cup, and says for Ninkasi. Then he sips. The priests don't stop him. No lightning bolt strikes. Just a quiet nod from one robed figure who murmurs she blesses all cups. You think about that as you return to the street. About foam and prophecy. About jars that speak and the quiet reverence of barley water given divine purpose. And as you walk past a shadowy corner where someone is clearly peeing against a wall, you're reminded sacred or not beer always finds its way back to the people. You find yourself following the winding side alleys, now those narrow unplanned passages where carts get stuck, gossip thrives, and some of the best things happen entirely off record. The hum of the temples fades behind you, replaced by clinks of pottery, soft laughter, and the unmistakable scent of warm barley mash escaping through poorly sealed shutters. You've stumbled into a corner of Mesopotamian life where things are a little less reverent. Because tonight you're going tavern hopping. Yes, even 40 years ago. There were taverns, roady, smoky, lopsided structures where people gathered not to worship or to work, but simply to be loud and forget things. You duck under a crooked awning and step into a dimly lit space. Clay walls, reed mats, low benches, every surface, stained with generations of spilled beer and bad decision. A woman behind a makeshift counter looks up, wipes her hands on her tunic, and asks, loud, medium, or soft. It takes you a second to realize she's not talking about music. Mainstream fact time. Mesopotamian taverns often served different types of beer, and customers had preferences not just for strength but for sound. Not unlike choosing between carbonated or still water, except your drink might wheeze or growl, depending on how it was brewed. The loud stuff foamed aggressively, fermented quickly, and packed with wild energy. The soft kind, likely matured longer, poured in whispers and went down like sleep in a cup. You ask for medium, and she pours you something that lets out a pleased burble as it hits the bowl. It smells sweet, almost fruity, with a hint of something burnt. Maybe roasted figs, or maybe the last customer's hair. You take a sip. It's warm, yeasty, oddly comforting. A man 2 stools down turns and grins. Careful. That one makes you see fish. You blink. Fish. He nods solemnly. Big ones. Here is your quirky tidbit. Some tavern goers believed that certain beers caused hallucinations, especially those from batches contaminated with wild fermentation agents. There's an Akkadian poem that hints at a drink so bold it opens the dream gate. Most historians chalk that up to poetic exaggeration or food poisoning. Others argue some brews may have had mild psychotropic effects depending on the herbs added. Historians still argue whether these tales of visionary beer were based on actual ingredients, ritual use, or just drunken storytelling at its Mesopotamian finest. Either way, you make a mental note not to finish the bowl. The tavern fills slowly as night deepens. No menus, no coins exchanging hands, just favors, bartering, and the occasional side-eye when someone tries to pay with a chicken that clearly belongs to someone else. You watch as a musician sets up in the corner, a lyre player with more confidence than tuning skills. She starts plucking a haunting little melody, and within moments the entire room has shifted, moodless, raucous, more contemplative. A woman at the next table pours a bit of her beer on the floor and murmurs something. A toast. A ritual. A subtle request that her husband finally fix the goat pen. You don't ask. It's not that kind of night. The tavern keeper returns with a bowl of something thick and steaming. Beer porridge, she says. For your stomach's regrets tomorrow. You politely decline, though your stomach seems interested. A pair of farmers argue at the next table over whose field produced the best barley. One claims his soil sings. The other insists his grains laugh when they're ground. A potter, clearly enjoying herself, declares that the best beer she ever tasted came from a vat accidentally stirred with a bronze sandal. Everyone laughs. The sandal man looks offended. And here, in the laughter and the clinks, you feel something profound. This is where beer became cultural cement. Not just payment, not just prayer, but connection. These taverns were Mesopotamia's social hubs, where deals were whispered, gossip was born, and community boundaries softened in the warmth of a shared bowl. You catch wind of an old law from the Code of Hammurabi. If a tavern keeper allows conspirators to gather in her house without reporting them, she shall be put to death. Bit of a buzzkill, honestly. But it tells you something. The authorities knew that people talked here. Plotted. Planned. They weren't afraid of the beer. They were afraid of the conversations it fueled. One story whispered near the bar recounts how a rebellion began with a spilled bowl and a too loud joke about the king's sandals. Probably apocryphal, but somehow believable. You ask the tavern keeper what the noisiest beer she ever served was. She smiles fondly and says it screamed when it hit the cup. But in a good way. You nod, not entirely sure what that means, and finish your bowl anyway. Later in the night, someone knocks over a full jar. The liquid splashes across the floor with a furious glup glup glup, and the entire room goes quiet. Bad omen, someone whispers. Or good luck, says another. The room debates it for 10 full minutes. No consensus is reached, but a second jar is poured in its honor, and somehow that feels like closure. As the fire dies down and yawns begin to outnumber arguments, the tavern keeper hums a lullaby, something about barley fields and tired gods. You lean back against the wall, the stone surprisingly warm. A soft foam hums in your cup, echoing faintly against the rim. This is the beer they don't write in temple records. The kind that doesn't get sealed in ritual jars or measured out for workers. This is people's beer, messy, alive, occasionally screaming, but deeply cherished. You close your eyes. The sounds around you blur into a liquid hush. For now, in this humble corner of an ancient city, the only thing more consistent than time is the endless burbling whisper of Mesopotamian beer. Morning comes grudgingly, dragging its feet like a teenager with chores. The sun rises over the rooftops of peeling back shadows and revealing the cities quietly steaming. Surface mud bricks warming up reed mats, hung out to dry, and doorways still crusted with last night's gossip. Somewhere nearby, someone's already dropped a bowl, cursed about it, and started the day. And so do you. You stretch. Your back cracks in 3 languages. Your breath smells vaguely like raisins left too long in the rain. And as you make your way toward the city's edge, you begin to notice something strange. Something you'd never considered before. Beer sticky chatty, sacred beer is everywhere. Not just in jars or taverns or temples, but in the very bones of the city. It's in the bricks. It's in the laws. And now you see, in the drains. Yes, Mesopotamian sewage. System sand. Their surprisingly beer-soaked legacy are your next stop. You reach a residential district where houses crowd against each other like gossiping aunties, each with a central courtyard, a couple of small rooms, and if they were lucky, a tiny clever trench cut into the street just outside the front door. These weren't decorative. They were your waste solution. Mainstream fact first. The ancient Mesopotamians had rudimentary drainage and sewage systems, including terracotta pipes, stone-lined pits, and street gutters designed to channel waste away from living spaces. And guess what consistently turned up in those channels during archaeological digs? Beer residue. Lots and lots of beer residue. Everyday life meant brewing in small batches at home, pouring out dregs, washing utensils, tossing spoiled mashal. Of it flowed down these ancient drains. It wasn't just garbage. It was history trickling away, sticky and loud. You crouch beside one such trench, watching as a thin rivulet of murky liquid slinks past like it knows it's unwelcome. It smells faintly sweet, with a sour tang that screams yesterday's mistake. You squint. No. There's a bit of foam, possibly alive. And here's your quirky tidbit: archaeologists found layers of beer scum caked in Mesopotamian drainage channels, enough to suggest not just casual waste, but systemic, almost enthusiastic beer disposal. Some scholars joke that entire streets functioned like giant rinsing racks. Others argue people were simply brewing too much, too often, with not enough patience to drink the failures. You trail the trench as it bends around a courtyard. A woman is pouring water over a bundle of straw, scrubbing out a bowl. The liquid runs off into the channel, carrying the scent of last night's weak ale with it. She notices you. Too bitter, she explains. The barley was grumpy. You nod solemnly, as if that makes sense. She points further down the channel. That house. They never rinse. Their trench yells. And sure enough, as you follow the flow, it gets noisier. You hear the glug of yesterday's spoiled batch meeting, the slap of bathwater, the fizz of soapy runoff, the distant floop of someone disposing what can only be described as an exercised porridge. Why? Historians still argue whether these trenches were designed primarily for sanitation or as informal brewing waste systems. The evidence supports both. Some neighborhoods had communal brew pits with overflow channels. Others suggest residents intentionally brewed closer to the drains to make cleanup easier. Either way, it's clear Mesopotamian beer didn't vanish, it decomposed in plain sight. There's something poetic about that. The very thing that built the economy, blessed the temples, and softened the worst evenings also oozed quietly into the infrastructure, forever binding itself to the bricks and clay. You pass by a worker with a long stick poking at a clogged section of the trench. He grunts, then pulls out a wad of half-fermented mash and grins. Lunch? Aight. He laughs. No compost. He tosses it into a nearby pit already buzzing with flies and opportunity. A boy nearby watches, holding a reed straw. He dips it into a bubbling puddle near the compost heap and sips. You stare. He shrugs. Tastes okay. There are no health codes, only consequences. A nearby baker tells you the trench is useful if you smell barley and soap, the batch is good. If it smells like fish and sandals, start again. You're not sure that's scientific, but you're also not arguing. You circle back toward a public well and notice a slab of etched stone nearby, possibly a notice or proclamation. The symbols are hard to read, but one local translates for you by order of the magistrate. Do not brew near the drains on festival days. The gods do not like shouting gutters. You love that. It's absurd, it's bureaucratic, and it means somewhere someone had to complain that the drains were too loud. You pass a wall where a list of beer types has been scratched with careful fingers. There's stormy barley, summerthroat, temple foam, and your new favorite, quiet cousin. Beneath it, someone has drawn a line toward the trench, ending in an unmistakable cartoon bubble. Someone's idea of a beer comic, 20 years before Sunday papers. In the late afternoon sun, the trenches start to steam slightly, releasing one last olfactory sonata. You pause, close your eyes, and listen. The drains burble softly, layers of sound from homes, brewers, temples. The whole city speaks not in words, but in foam and runoff. You finally understand Mesopotamian beer didn't just echo in cups, it echoed in the ground. This city didn't drain beer like waste. It recycled its voice again and again, from cup to lip, to drain to earth. And maybe that's why it still whispers 4,000 years later, under your feet. You take one last glance into the trench. It blinks, or burps. Hard to tell. Time to move on. No, but you walk slower now, ears open, because you know somewhere between the gutters and the god's beer is still talking. By now your sandals are heavy with the dust of the day, and your brain's buzzing with more barley than a harvest song. But as the evening shadows stretch across the rooftops of ancient Ur, there's one place you haven't visited, Ytone beer-soaked sanctuary, where science, scandal, and syrupy foam all collide. You make your way toward the edge of the scribal quarter, where the streets narrow again, into a grid of quiet workshops and garden plots. It's surprisingly peaceful. Reed fences lean lazily, and the scent in the air has shifted less fermentation, more ink and clay tablets. You're approaching a house with a peculiar layout, part kitchen, part study, part something else entirely. This is where brewing met experimentation. Mainstream historical fact in ancient Mesopotamia, particularly among the educated elite and temple scribes, beer was a medium for controlled experimentation. Not in a modern scientific method kind of way, but still recipes were tested, adjusted, recorded, and sometimes hoarded like state secrets. Brewing wasn't just for festivals and field workers. It became a serious intellectual pursuit. You duck beneath a woven curtain and step into the home of what we'd call today a beer nerd. The room is cool, full of half-finished cuneiform tablets, dusty jars labeled with symbols, and a cat that looks deeply unimpressed by your existence. There's a thin scroll tacked to the wall, listing something that might be a brewing calendar, or just someone's dream journal, written in barley metaphors. A man in a tunic leans over a clay table, furrowed brow lit by oamp. Oamp. You clear your throat. He gestures vaguely to a corner filled with squat sealed pots. Don't touch the third one. It's volatile. You don't ask. You just quietly admire the setup, multiple brewing vessels at different stages. Reeds arranged by length, odd additives, nearby dates, coriander, even a small dish of what looks suspiciously like crushed lapis lazuli. Decorative. Medicinal. Who knows? Here is your quirky tidbit. Some Mesopotamian brewers experimented with enhanced beer, infusing it with exotic spices, minerals, and even crushed gemstones. Was it alchemy, early pharmacology, or just expensive beer with placebo sparkle? Historians still argue whether these additives were genuinely believed to improve health, or were status symbols masquerading as brewmaster bravado. You ask the brewer about it. He shrugs and says the blue powder makes people feel lucky. That's enough. It's hard to argue with that logic. He shows you a waxy tablet filled with wedge-shaped script. A beer recipe, though unlike any you've seen before. This one includes precise timing, specific grain-to-water ratios, even a note about wait for third moon before opening. You point at the line. He nods. He nods. That one's for rain beer. Rain beer. It only works if you brew during a thunderstorm, he explains with complete sincerity. The gods add flavor. Historians still argue whether these weather-specific brews were genuinely functional or just ritualistic performance. The jury's out. But it's clear that Mesopotamian brewers didn't just stir and pray, they tinkered, tracked, and taught each other. This wasn't chaotic guesswork. It was methodology wrapped in incense. At one point, he shows you a failed batch, pale, flat, and completely silent. Doesn't even whisper, he mutters. Dead beer. He pours some into a bowl and flicks it with a reed. Not a bubble. Not a fizz. Just a sigh of defeat. You ask how many batches has brewed. He snorts. Hundreds. Thousands. Half of them by mistake. A small tablet near the door is scratched with tally marks. Some are grouped. Some have sad little faces next to them. One just says, never again. He invites you to try a newer baccione with a reddish tint and a sticky floral aroma. It tastes like dates and something faintly metallic, like licking a copper spoon in a garden. You make a face. He beams. That's the iron. For strength. You're not convinced it's working. As the room darkens, he lights a second oil lamp, and the shadows on the wall start to dance like the ancient gods themselves have shown up to taste a test. He leans back and sighs, clay-stained fingers resting on a brewpot, still humming with fermentation. It's alive, you know, he says. You don't make beer. You guide it. Like raising a pet that occasionally explodes. You nod, because that might be the most accurate description of brewing you've ever heard. From outside, a chorus of frogs begins croaking in the irrigation canals. Somewhere, a pot breaks. You both ignore it. Before you leave, he hands you a tiny sealed jar with a smirk. Careful. That one's still arguing with itself. You tuck it into your satchel, not entirely sure what that means. As you step out, you look back at the small house of quiet chaos. 1 part lab, 1 part kitchen, 1 part shrine. This is where the real legacy of Mesopotamian beer breathes in, the quiet corners where people didn't just drink, but documented. Not for kings, not for gods, but for knowledge, for curiosity. Forever. You walk away thinking even in 2000 BCE, someone was taking notes just in case future generations needed to know what not to add to barley mash. And maybe that's what separates history from trivia. The scribes, the tinkerers, the ones who whispered to their beer and waited to see what whispered back. By now, twilight has folded itself gently over like a worn linen cloak. The city's outer walls cast long shadows on the dusty roads, and flickers of oil lamps glow behind latticework windows. Most of the city has retreated indoors. Dogs have stopped barking. Even the ever-boisterous beer sellers have dimmed their cries. But you're not heading home just yet. There's one final thread to untangle how Mesopotamians passed their beer knowledge down through time generation by careful clay-scraping generation. You wander toward a temple, district not the grand ziggurat, where priests sacrifice doves and shout at stars, but a modest side annex where scribes train in the most sacred art of all writing things down, so other people can misinterpret them centuries later. Mainstream fact beer recipes and brewing records were written in cuneiform, making them among the oldest documented food prep texts in human history. These weren't just lists of ingredients, they were stylized, structured, and in some cases poetic. Some were even incantation-like, blending instruction with praise to deities, like Ninkasi, the goddess of beer. You slip quietly into the scribal school, where rows of boys and a few girls squat on mats, rolling clay tablets, and etching tiny wedges into them with reeds. One child proudly reads his latest work aloud. It's a hymn to a god of war or wisdom, but to the frothy miracle of brewed barley. The beer bubbles. The beer flows its foam, the sky its color gold. Everyone claps. A nearby scribe nods in approval. That's how we remember. The best recipes rhyme. You grin. Of course they do. It's Mesopotamia's version of the lefty-loosey righty-tighty rule, except for yeast proportions. One tablet catches your eye square, smooth the size of a slice of toast, but heavier. The etchings read like a standard recipe until you reach the middle, and then wait while the moon waxes. If it does not foam, throw salt on the floor, and begin again. You ask why salt. The instructor shrugs. Some say it wakes the beer spirit. Some say it's just dramatic. Here is your quirky tidbit. Certain Mesopotamian brewing instructions included symbolic gestures or household superstitions, like scattering salt, whispering to the fermentation jars, or drawing protective eyes near the brewing vessels. Were these practical, spiritual, or just scribal mischief? Historians still argue whether these flourishes were part of religious ritual or brewers' humor codified into clay. You sit beside a student working on his first full recipe. He's chewing his reed stylus, anxiously tapping his foot in rhythm with some internal fermentation cycle. You glance at his tablet. He's written, "Wet the barley. Pray it listens. Wait. Wait more. Stir, but not too much. Ask someone smarter. Serve before it's angry." You're pretty sure that's half real, half joke, but either way, it's accurate. And this is how it spreads beer wisdom, not just carved into tablets, but whispered between lines, tucked into rhythms passed from fingertips to stylus to student across centuries. The instructor pulls out a thicker tablet, an older one darkened and chipped at the edges. It's a copy of the hymn to Ninkasi, the most famous beer text in history. He recites it softly, voice low and melodic. Ninkasi. You are the one who handles the dough, and with a big shovel mixes the honey sweet. It goes on for many lines, blending technique with reverence. Each stanza reflects a brewing step, steeping, mashing, fermenting, and filtering through reed baskets. It's not just a prayer. It's a mnemonic recipe, meant to be sung aloud, possibly while brewing. Who needs measuring cups when you've got a chorus? And here's the thing, despite its lofty poetic structure, this hymn gives modern historians real tangible insights into ancient brewing. It suggests beer was made from bread-like loaves called bapir, which were soaked, mashed, and fermented in elegant shortcut, in a world without grocery stores. You ask the instructor if students ever make their own brews. He chuckles. No, only once. After that, they prefer tablets. But he admits some scribes, especially those in temples tied to agriculture or trade, did become dedicated brewing specialists. Their job wasn't just to write it down. It was to observe trends, record harvest conditions, track ingredient variations, and preserve brewing truths like a barley-bound oracle. You wonder how many variations of one recipe they tried before settling on the final sacred version. Probably dozens, possibly hundreds, all of them echoing through the stylus scratches of apprentice scribes who just wanted to impress someone. As you prepare to leave, one student stops you. Do you want to try mine? He asks shyly, handing you a palm-sized tablet still damp with clay. You read the top line: for the beer that does not betray the throat. It's oddly moving. You tell him to keep it safe. Oh. He nods solemnly, then promptly drops it. It lands face down. He groans. You both laugh. It's okay, he says, scooping it up, now smeared. Beer forgets. We write again. As you walk out under the moonlight, you realize just how deeply beer was woven into Mesopotamian literacy. It wasn't just a drink, it was a curriculum. A shared language of foam and grain humming quietly in every clay tablet from ziggurat to tavern. You pass a wall with faded graffiti, scratched long ago. Best beer is made under stars. Worst beer's made in a hurry. It's not cuneiform. It's just someone's doodle. And yet, it feels just as sacred. Because in the end, every recipe was a story, and every story had a brew worth telling. You leave the scribal quarter behind, and for the first time tonight the streets are nearly empty. No more herders, no wandering merchants with clay beads, not even a sleepy donkey braying into the void. The city of has finally exhaled. But your journey isn't quite over. As your sandals slap softly against the worn cobblestones, you take a detour toward the open fields just beyond the outer canal. This is where the barley begins, and where, strangely enough, some of it ends up again. Tonight Uwe wandered straight into the one part of Mesopotamian beer life most people never talk about: the leftovers. Mainstream historical fact byproducts from brewing were widely reused. Spent grain wasn't discarded. It was fed to animals, repurposed in baking, or composted to fertilize the very fields where the next barley cycle would grow. Nothing was wasted. Even spoiled beer had a use, if not as livestock feed, then in cleaning ritual offerings or the occasional unfortunate bribe. You pass a cluster of small huts where farmers have stacked piles of fragrant soggy mash out to dry. One of them waves you over. You're just in time, she says. Goats are starving for beer bread. She's not kidding. At her feet, 2 goats eye you warily, bleating as if offended you didn't bring your own bucket of leftovers. She lifts a flat disc of what looks like barley biscuit and snaps it in half. The goats rush in. They eat better than we do, she mutters. No taxes. You sit on an overturned jar, as she explains. The leftover Baperthos thick beer Loveskin be crumbled, dried, and reused as goat feed, or softened and re-fermented into a weak beer called Kuran Sidhu. It's cloudy, thin, and tastes vaguely like regret, but it gets the job done. Here is your quirky tidbit: in some records, this second-run beer was humorously nicknamed Slave's Courage or Tired Man's Wine. It was cheap, sour, and sometimes made you burp more than it made you tipsy. Still, it was better than nothing. And historians still argue whether these low-grade beers were purely functional or had a cultural niche of their own comfort drink. Bargain buzz, social equalizer, maybe all of the above. The farmer hands you a chipped clay cup. Try some. It's not fresh, but it's not dead. You sip. It tastes like barley tea that fell asleep during a thunderstorm. Somehow, you don't mind. Across the fields you can see figures working by moonlight, stirring ditches and planting early rows of emmer. They're laughing. Someone starts singing a verse you heard earlier in the scribal school. The one about beer bubbling, like the stars. There's a full circle calm to it. You stroll to a nearby storage pit, where a few more villagers are scraping dried crust from the walls of old brewing vats. It smells sharp like vinegar and ghostly bread, but they're gathering it carefully. Good for gardens, one explains. And curses if you ask the wrong priest. You try to scrape a little yourself. It flakes off in brittle sheets dark as molasses. You're told it's called dregskake, and it's used in dozens of ways: fuel insulation, even chewing tobacco if you're desperate and a bit reckless. Someone laughs nearby. Beer gets everywhere, doesn't it? And they're right. It's in the fields, the kitchens, the prayers, the goats, the jokes. Even the mud bricks used in construction sometimes include bits of discarded barley husk ground, so fine it just vanishes into the sun-baked walls. You run your hand along one of those walls now, and sure enough it's gritty. Ancient beer dust in every crevice. The last person you meet tonight is a brewer turned healer. He carries a small pouch of dried grains and a jar of honey beer that he claims treats fevers and uncooperative moods. He tells you that he learned brewing from his grandmother, who learned from her uncle, who said he once served a cup to a king, who spit it out and still gave him a silver ring. Sometimes the story matters more than the taste, he says. You ask how many brews he's made. Enough to know the ones not to repeat. That seems to be the Mesopotamian motto. As the stars blink awake over the empty canal, you finally sit. There's nothing left to chase. The barley has been soaked, baked, fermented, sung to blessed, spilled, scraped, recycled and fed to goats. You've wandered every stage of the beers. Ancient life, cycle from temple hymns to pub brawls, from scribal tablets to grain-fed donkeys. And the strange thing is nothing felt wasted. Because in this civilization of cracked clay and crooked reed roofs, beer was more than a drink. It was a cycle, a philosophy, a noisy, bubbly heartbeat that echoed through time, not because it was perfect, but because it was shared. So as the last cup empties and the last torch flickers out, you lean back and let your eyes rest on the sky. Just one more Mesopotamian looking up and wondering, what if the gods didn't invent beer? What if they just drank it and took the credit? Now the fire has dwindled to embers, the jars are sealed, and the goats have finally fallen silent. The barley fields sway gently in the night breeze, and the distant hum of frogs has replaced the noise of the city. You lie back on a woven mat, under the stars, every bone in your body heavy with sleep and your thoughts softening like cooling bread loaves. The sky above you is exactly the kind that ancient brewers once watched as they stirred their pots, endless, quiet, and unbothered. Let it all drift now. The songs of Ninkasi, the hiss of fermenting pots, the clatter of clay styluses, scribbling out one last note about when to add the bapir. All those sounds grow distant, muffled by time and rest. You don't need to carry them anymore. Your breath matches the rhythm of an ancient irrigation canal, slow and sure. The kind that feeds barley by moonlight. The kind that remembers stories even when no one's telling them. The world of ancient Mesopotamian beer fades into mist, not gone, just resting, like a jar sealed for the season. Waiting? Dreaming. Still bubbling somewhere beneath the lid. You're safe here. You've made it through the noise, the mess, the mystery. And somehow you survived the goats. So let your limbs sink deeper. Let your thoughts soften. Let the silence swell. Because the night is long, the beer is done, and the story, well, the story has earned sleep. Good night.